observation post, a great place to put a sniper, and we need to get security out and secure the areas around this central part of Baghdad, and that's what is going to be taking place.
Well, there are these buildings that surround this square. Yeah, they're buildings that surround this square, and U.S. forces have been out in the open there, and you can see these soldiers. You know, they're moving up against this wall to get some, to try to figure out whether they can get some shelter here.
Yeah, these Marines are not particularly sanguine anymore. They're moving to a spot from which perhaps they can move on or establish a base of fire on the place where they think the sniper's coming from. Like
yeah, it looks sort of to the left of that picture that we were seeing there is where the shots had come from, although I can't be certain. The camera panned to the left a little while ago, and they were looking at a building. And of course, this is the area where U.S. forces said they heard snipers firing at them yesterday.
Yes, from the Palestine hotels right in this region. And it goes back to something that Chris just mentioned. What does it take to wreak little havoc? And the fact is, it takes one guy. That's all it takes. As you can see, a couple of shots fired, and the party's over. Security is very, very important and extremely difficult to establish, especially this time of day, with so few forces in the center part of a large city. It's going to be an ongoing effort to provide security for both the force and the Iraqi people in Baghdad.
Who are the people who would be doing this at this point? I mean, as we mentioned earlier, the Republican Guard forces probably have shed their uniforms, and some are trying to get away from here as opposed to sticking around. You say it can just be one person. It can be some sort of loyal Saddam Hussein supporter left with some ammunition and a gun. But I mean, would you think at this point there's much organized opposition left in Baghdad?
I shouldn't think so. I ought to ask Colonel Mike Brown about that, because he's been heavily involved in this sort of thing for his entire career.
Mike,
I wouldn't think it was really organized.
I don't believe it's organized, and very likely you do have the holdouts out there. These people also fire weapons into the air in celebration. So you've got lots of weapons in the area, and I think it goes back to vigilance by the military forces. As they establish security, they've got to watch each other, and they're also going to be protecting the people that are around them, that they're surrounding.
Yeah, and we've seen some of the photographers who are now wandering the streets at will. And we have some more activity.
Around the statue.
Yeah, although there's some questions now about exactly whether or not this is the statue that we were told it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
There's a question about whether or not we're sure this is the statue of Saddam Hussein, although every other piece of information we had is that this is the one that was erected in honor of his 65th birthday. He would be 66 April 28th if he's still alive.
Well, what I was saying was it looks like it's a U.S. vehicle that is now moving closer. They'd been using this vehicle to help climb up and get on top of the statue and put the rope around the neck of this statue of Saddam Hussein. Yeah, I mean, it's very close to where this is happening. On the one hand, you have the statue out in the middle of the square, and then just to the left, you have what appeared to be a sniper fire.
People running for cover.
Right, right. But the people have now moved back into the square, closer to the statue of Saddam Hussein, and U.S. forces, despite that gunfire you saw a little while ago, are helping out with the attempt to bring the statue down, it looks like.
Now, I'll tell you what they're using here. But it looked like there was going to be some sort of jury-rigged arrangement with a hawser line of people climbing up and putting a rope around his neck, and that was probably symbolic. What they've got here now is a Marine tank recovery vehicle. And that is going to have, before you saw what looked like the world's strongest man with an 8-pound sledgehammer trying to take down the base, reinforced, was actually doing a pretty good job of it,
too.
He
was taking chunks out of that base.
And who ultimately climbed on top of the pedestal, which is astounding because the guy looked like he weighed about 260. I weigh nothing, and I'd have a hard time climbing up a rope to do that. But now they're not messing around. They brought a tank recovery, I think it's an M88 tank recovery vehicle. And the United States Marine Corps, I believe, is getting ready to pull this statue down using very serious equipment now.
And seeing as this was all started, obviously, by the citizens of Baghdad, who, as you rightly pointed out, a number of them climbed up and rappelled down that statue, you don't see any symbolic problem with the Marines going up there in terms of the message it might send elsewhere?
Well, I'm a very cautious person, and as a result, I might have thought twice about it, but my guess is that the commander in charge here, who's probably a battalion or company commander, has asked for permission to do this. This is not something that he's probably going to do on his own. And if you think back about what the administration has said we're all up to, that is, we're involved in disarming this regime and regime change. Perhaps yanking down a statue of the symbol of the regime is exactly what the doctor orders.
Well, in fact, you know, we've seen as U.S. forces moved into Iraq, the tanks have rolled over a couple of statues and pictures of Saddam Hussein and monuments built to Saddam Hussein that we've seen in the south, at least south of Baghdad. So it really doesn't come as a huge surprise that U.S. forces would help out a bit with trying to bring.
This is making me a little nervous here.
Yeah, with them trying to help bring this statue down.
Can you tell what he's got in his hand there? What's?
Well,
there it is.
Yeah. I was just about, Mike and I were talking, it's just this kind of thing maybe the administration doesn't necessarily want to see. I don't think they mind having the Americans pull a statue of Saddam Hussein down, but if you recall a few days ago when I think it was the Marines or the 101st unfurled an American flag, I think the command got a little upset. What we're trying to do is get an Iraqi face on this, I believe. But
yeah, I think obviously the concern is that there were charges throughout the Arab world that the United States was coming in to be an occupying force. We saw time and time and time again from our reporters in that part of the world saying that people they talked to on the streets believed the United States was coming in because they wanted Iraq's oil, and that the face the administration wants to put on this is one of liberation, not occupation.
Yeah, I would have been disinclined to do what these guys are doing. I probably would have pulled the statue down, but like you said, we really want to, and sooner rather than later, get an Iraqi face on this entire operation. And, you know, maybe this is not necessarily something that I would have done.
Well, at the same time, it's important to point out that many Americans have lost their lives in this war, and that these young men and women feel very strongly about what they've done, and so in some ways it's not a huge surprise that they're up on that fighting vehicle with the flag on the face of Saddam Hussein.
And one of the things that's occurred to me is we've seen the faces over the last several weeks now at Landstuhl of wounded Americans, some of whom will have a pretty long haul ahead of them in rehab, and PFC Jessica Lynch, who has more injuries than you can count lying in that bed in Landstuhl. And I wonder if they're watching this and what their reaction is.
You certainly can't fault them. These are 19, 20, 22-year-old kids. They've been through a lot. They've seen their friends killed and wounded and maimed. They've been fighting their way, and a pretty tough fight for the Marines, I might add.
That may be an Iraqi holding the American flag down below the base of the statue.
You know, we were talking before, Mike and I, about the fact that we saw what we thought were Free Iraqi forces in a vehicle wearing berets, and they are right down here on the square, and it may have been Iraqi who threw that up there. Who knows? But you're right. They've had a tough go of it, slogging their way all the way from Kuwait up through Nasiriyah and then Al-Qut, and then fighting a very difficult battle to get across the Diyala River and then to the airport in the southwest of the city, and then all the way up here. They've seen their friends killed and wounded. It's been a tough slog. You can't fault them for doing the emotional thing, but cooler heads, I think, have prevailed here, geopolitical heads, and have told them to take the flag down.
Yeah, war like life, I guess, Colonel, is a matter of perspective, and the mothers of the Marines who sat at home day after day after day waiting for word, letting a month go by, not hearing from their sons or daughter, wondering if they were alive or dead. I imagine they're sitting at home and they don't have any trouble with this, but there is obviously a symbolism that may be tough to take for some of the people in the Arab world, but we are reminded that 96 Americans have lost their lives so far in this conflict, and 30 on the British side, and the Iraqi flag flying there alongside the stars and stripes that were being held up.
You know, there may be people on the West Coast who have been just joining us this morning, and we might just go back over what we've seen as they turn on their television sets. The world's probably watching this. U.S. troops have swept into the heart of Baghdad today, as you can see, and they were welcomed by some cheering Iraqis as they approach this Firdos Square, which is near the Palestine Hotel, where journalists have been broadcasting for the last few days. Some official buildings have been gutted by looters, and people with guns have been running wild in the capital. U.S. forces, as we said, seized this city center, this square. And we heard from President Bush through Ari Fleischer that he was heartened but cautious about what he had seen and heard this morning on television. This operation is not over. It's far from over. But what it appears we are watching here before our eyes is the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime, the apparent collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime, although there is more to come, a lot more to come for U.S. forces.
And the more we see scenes like this, Colonel Jacobs, the more do you believe it's likely that U.S. troops are going to get an awful lot of help on having fingers pointed at those pockets of resistance?
Yeah, I think they are. Don't forget that, as Colonel Mike Brown mentioned, the 4th Infantry Division has been bulking up down in Kuwait. It's got one brigade just about ready to roll. It's got another brigade. That's another 4,000 troops, plus its support slice. Probably going to be ready within a week to 10 days or so. And they're going to need the help, too, because they need assistance not only to control the situation inside Baghdad, but don't forget, we've got northern Iraq to go after as well, and that remains to be done. By the way, you mentioned the Iraqi flag. We did see an Iraqi flag. I noticed it looked like the Syrian flag. It didn't have any writing on it, but we've been advised that that Iraqi flag that you're seeing now is the old Iraqi flag that is with the 3 stars before Saddam Hussein had Allahu Akbar, God is great, inscribed on the flag and made it official, so it didn't seem like he was so much of the secular tyrant that he was, and to ingratiate himself to the Muslim world. And that's the only reason he put it on there. That's the old Iraqi flag.
Yeah, in northern Iraq, the American flag being waved by some Iraqis there, and this is the old Iraqi flag that we're watching, as you mentioned. You know, when I look at these pictures at the square here, we're reminded by the fact, Chris had mentioned earlier that Iraqi TV was back on, that at least U.S. forces had taken over Iraqi TV, but the city of Baghdad is without electricity, we understand, and there's really not a huge crowd at this square in a town of millions of people.
5 million, is it?
So,
4.5?
Yeah. So I would suspect that there are probably a lot of Iraqis who have no idea this is going on. It's at least in the city of Baghdad. Mike, talk about that for a moment.
And you're exactly right. I think the families are really still in their homes, really wondering what is going on. They see U.S. forces, the military might of the U.S. Throughout the city. The military leaders are going to be focused on security, focused on maintaining control in their sectors. And I think General Petrosky said it right the other day. Success for us is going to be the first time that we start seeing children feeling safe enough to be able to come back out on the streets.
We heard so much 3 weeks ago about shock and awe, how much of this war would be dominated by the skies. What role now for the skies over Baghdad and the rest of the country?
Well, I think that the role of air power has significantly changed already. That is, we hit lots and lots of strategic targets around the country, but particularly in Baghdad, command, control, communications, and intelligence facilities for quite a bit of time before our ground forces got up ahead of steam. Up until that point, I think something on the neighborhood of 75 or 80% of the targets that were hit were by air were strategic targets. However, as forces started to move north, you saw a shift in the application of air power to tactical targets and a greater percentage of targets that were close air support strikes, attacks on ground troops who were opposing our forces, military vehicles, targets of opportunity where airstrikes were called in and not more than 5 or 10 minutes later a strike occurred to support American troops on the ground. Once that happened, you then saw a shift of targets into Baghdad itself and a diminution of much smaller number of airstrikes taking place because of the really concentrated nature of the area of operations. Very small area. We don't want collateral damage. We don't want civilian casualties. A drop-off in attacks from air that took place in the south and a shift in the use of air power up to the north. And I think in the ensuing days, we're going to see lots more of that, as you and I discussed, Mike.
Exactly, Jack. As we start shifting the combat air sorties north towards Tikrit, and I believe the Ottoman division, Republican Guard division that's still up there, still a potential threat. We will also likely see an increase in aerial surveillance and reconnaissance. Because we've got the technologies with the unmanned aerial vehicles to be able to really keep a good eye to provide the leaders on the ground situational awareness of what is going on. It's a very big desert, very big country out there, and so there's going to be a lot to keep track of in order to maintain and minimize any threats.
When you talk about maintaining as well, I was surprised this morning when I heard from Chip Reed that they were very low on supplies. He said they were down to 1 MRE a day, that they really didn't have any water. What about the supply lines now?
Yeah, the supply lines are extremely long, as we already know. Some of the complaints about the number of forces available to Tommy Franks, particularly at the beginning of the operation, had to do not with a concern about whether or not there would be sufficient combat power to overwhelm the Iraqi force. I don't think there were too many concerns about that, but I think there was some concern, and there probably still should be some concern, about our ability to secure our lines of communication, 275 to 300 miles long, from Kuwait all the way up to Baghdad, and by the way, beyond when we start moving. We need to have forces in order to secure the rear so we can move these supplies up quickly. Now, there are two things about that that give me a little bit less concern.
All right, we are now being told that the building that was on fire is the Ministry of Finance. We were able to see a shot from our position at the Palestine Hotel, but at 45 minutes after the hour, here's what has been happening, an extraordinary scene that's been unfolding in Baghdad, in northern Iraq, and across the country. Starting here in the heart of Baghdad, where U.S. troops swept in, there was an ecstatic welcome from crowds of people who were seen waving American flags and who have been trying for at least the last hour or so to pull down this monument to Saddam Hussein. There has also been a downside to this, however. First of all, there are pockets of resistance, particularly in eastern Baghdad, and we have seen scenes of looting and chaos in other parts of the city. People walking down the street, pushing everything from refrigerators to huge military tires, raising the question of what exactly they're going to do with them. But people raiding businesses, raiding factories, and raiding each other's homes. And President Bush, for his part, who has been following this through updates at his National Security Council meeting, has said he is heartened, but he is cautious. This war is not over. Only 10 to 20% of Baghdad, according to U.S. officials, is in U.S. control. And of course, there are still major cities, including Tikrit and Mosul, that could pose a serious concern.
President Bush has talked about the noose tightening around the neck of Saddam Hussein, and symbolically, that's exactly what's happening in Firdos Square in Baghdad right now, as U.S. forces are helping the Iraqi people pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein. It was built to commemorate Saddam Hussein's 65th birthday. It's a little over a year old, and U.S. forces are tightening the rope that they have around the neck of this statue and moving slowly backward. And you can see the people around the base of the statue have moved back so they don't get hurt. They were at the base of the statue, the Iraqis, hammering away, trying to figure out a way to bring this thing down. And at the same time, a symbol of what appears to be Saddam Hussein's regime about to crash down.
We are being told that at that meeting of the National Security Council, which has been going on for a couple of hours now, that the president is continuing to get what they call good reports from the field, from the military point of view. And this is still a military mission, and so lives are still at stake. That's a constant reminder from this administration, who wants to balance what are obviously scenes of jubilation and a quickly moving scene. Very few people expected to see tanks rolling in Baghdad on this day, but nevertheless, understanding that there are still American and British forces out there, and also average Iraqi citizens whose lives may be threatened in the coming days and weeks.
Well, we've seen such a dramatic scene here, and it's changed over the last 15 or 20 minutes, but at first there was jubilation as these tanks rolled into Firdos Square in the center of Baghdad, and then about an hour or so later, what we saw and heard apparently were shots, and this has been the scene of sniper fire over the last couple of days, and I believe they're about to bring this statue down. A powerful moment in history, April 9, 2003. The day some say Baghdad fell. As U.S. forces helped the Iraqi people bring down a symbol of Saddam Hussein in the central part of Baghdad. Jubilation in the streets as this statue commemorating the birthday of Saddam Hussein fell just moments ago.